Hello, everybody. I think that means that we're going to go ahead and get started. Before we do anything at all, I want to share that the University of Arizona sits on the traditional land of the Tana Adam, who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We acknowledge this land as the foundation upon which our education is based and from which it is informed. We are aligned with the university's core value of a diverse and inclusive community. It is our institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up the Wildcat community. Hello, my name is Veronica Reyes Escudero, and I'm the Catherine B. Willock Head of Special Collections. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to Special Collections' first virtual event. We are grateful for the partnership between the University Libraries, Special Collections, and Dean and Professor Emerita Patricia McCorkadale to bring you this timely event marking the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which afforded some women the right to vote. We're excited for all of our panelists. I thank them for being gracious for their time. I have a few Zoom housekeeping and introductions. We ask everyone to please keep your mics muted and use chat to ask your questions when the time comes, or I suppose you can send them along. If your question is directed to a particular panelist, please let us know by including their name in the chat. We're recording this event, so if you don't want to be on the recording, feel free to shut down your video and change your name. The link of the recording will be posted on the Special Collections website. Lastly, please use the speaker view option on Zoom so you can see all of our speakers tonight. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our moderators, my colleagues, Erica Castaño and Mary Feeney, who are also two of the co-curators of the online exhibition, Founding Mothers, From the Ballot Box to the University. Erica Castaño is the Digital Initiatives Archivist and the University of Arizona History Curator in Special Collections at the University of Arizona Libraries. She coordinates overall digital initiatives for making archival materials available to the public and works with students and faculty in the research and teaching related to the history of the University of Arizona. Mary Feeney has been librarian for the University of Arizona for over 20 years. She's a news research specialist and liaison librarian for gender and women's studies, history, journalism, and sociology of the libraries, where she partners with faculty and students in their research, teaching, and learning. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing your faces. Mary Feeney, please take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and welcome everyone. We're really excited to have you join us tonight. While women in Arizona won the right to vote in 1912, the ratification in 1920 of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution secured the right to vote for most other women across the United States, but of course not everyone. 2020 marked the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the US, and we also saw the election of Kamala Harris, the first female vice president, first Black vice president, and first South Asian vice president. This evening, we want to celebrate these historic moments. We will also reflect on and discuss the continuing need to advance equal rights and ways that citizens, community members, and institutions can promote equal rights and inclusive participation in democracy. The library's online exhibit that Veronica mentioned, Founding Mothers from the Ballot Box to the University, explores these themes. And I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Patricia McCorkadale, who will introduce the exhibit to you. Patricia McCorkadale is Emerita Professor in Gender and Women's Studies and Dean Emerita of the Honors College at the University of Arizona. Trained as a sociologist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, she studied the entry of women into traditionally male careers, gender roles and sexuality, and career aspirations of Arizona youth, with attention to interest in science, technology, engineering, and math. An active feminist, she held fellowships in the Kellogg National Leadership Program and Tucson Public Voices. Her current research focuses on the history of the founding of the UA Department of Gender and Women's Studies, which is also part of the exhibit. So I'll turn it over to you now, Patricia.
Thank you, Mary. As we approach 2020, and I realized that this year would be both the 45th anniversary of the founding of the Women's Studies Program and the 100th anniversary of the national movement to gain suffrage, I proposed to the U of A Library Special Collections that we create an exhibit to celebrate these two milestones. I really want to thank Mary Feeney and Erica Castaño for their support in making this exciting exhibit. They listened to my crazy ideas and had the expertise to turn them into something that's really, I think, fascinating. The exhibit, Founding Mothers from the Ballot Box to the University, frames both suffrage and women's studies in a national context while telling the inspiring story of Arizona leaders who both persevered and persisted for many, many years to see their goals accomplished. Both dimensions of the women's movement sought to have women's voices heard. The question of who belongs and who has rights are central to both time periods. The exhibit explores the arguments that were used to exclude women's voices, the strategies that the women used, and how they sought allies. Although both efforts can be considered successes, the exhibit documents two significant shortcomings. First, neither effort was successful in including all women, women of different races, ethnicities, religions, classes, and national origins. The work of inclusive, fair representation continues today to be an issue both in the ballot box, in the university, and in many other social institutions. And second, while progress was made in providing equality of rights, the challenges and practices faced by the founding mothers continue to silence, devalue, and ignore the voices of women and people of color. I look forward to hearing the panelists discuss how we can apply what we've learned from past social movements to work toward a greater equality of rights. And now I'll turn it back to Mary, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. McCorkadale, for introducing the exhibit. There's an amazing amount of information and archival images and documents available there, so I hope all of you will be able to take some time to explore it. Now I'm really honored to introduce our three panelists. Pima County Recorder Gabriela Casares Kelly leads the office that oversees voter registration, early voting, and document recording for the county. A former Red for Ed public school educator and community organizer, she co-founded Indivisible Thono, a grassroots community organization that provides opportunities for education and civic engagement for members of her tribe, the Tohono O'odham Nation. Recorder Casares Kelly is the first Native American to hold an elected Pima County office and the third Native American to hold a county level office in Arizona. Heidi J. Oselair received her doctorate in U.S. history at Arizona State University, and her research field is political women in Arizona history. Her book, Winning Their Place, Arizona Women in Politics, 1883 to 1950, has been praised for its pioneering research on woman suffrage and female office holding. Professor Oselair is serving as producer and historical consultant for The Women on the Mother Road, a three-part documentary on the women of Route 66, which is scheduled for broadcast on PBS in 2021. And Lisa M. Sanchez is the assistant professor in the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. She holds a doctorate in political science with distinction from the University of New Mexico and is an alumnus of the Robert Wood Johnson Center for Health Policy. Professor Sanchez's research focuses on racial and ethnic politics in the United States. So a warm welcome to our panelists, and now I'm going to turn it over to Erica.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for setting the stage and bringing us to the main portion of our event tonight, which is a discussion about the equality of rights and looking historically and contemporary today. So we'll start with our a question for everyone on the panel. And our introductory question is, as Mary talked about in the introduction, 2020 was a historical year, both for the 100th anniversary of women of suffrage and for the election of the first woman, first Black, and first South Asian vice president. Would each of you reflect on what impact these historical moments have had on you? Or what impact did the 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote and the historical election outcomes in 2020 have on you? So let's start with Gabriela first.
Well, first, I'd just like to say Skuktash, Anya Neptugi, Gabriela Casares Kelly, Bismo Amjad. Hello, I'm Gabriela Casares Kelly. I'm from the communities of Bismo and Kupk, which are located on the Thanatam Nation. And I always introduce myself in this traditional way to remind people that, these languages are still here, they're still spoken. And so actually the story of the 100-year the centennial of women's suffrage is part of what really pushed me to get involved. It's actually, I started doing research about women's suffrage. Really just, it started out very casually. I started thinking about it one day, and it was we're thinking 2020 and 1920. And I realized my grandmother was born in 1918. My grandmother is a Thanatam woman, and I realized that she was born and that would have impacted her, but because we were born Native American, she wouldn't have had the right, she wouldn't have been considered a citizen of the United States until 1924. And in Arizona, she actually wouldn't have gotten the right to vote until 1948. However, she wouldn't have had the protection for voting until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. My grandmother didn't speak English and didn't have protections for her language until the late 1970s, which is really not that long ago. And so when we're talking about disenfranchised communities, or we're pointing fingers and saying these groups of people don't vote, we really have to understand that we're talking about people who are starting from different starting lines. We are not all at the same starting line. And some communities have a much larger legacy of voting, and some of us are just getting started. And so that has absolutely been part of my narrative as I have been painting throughout 2020 and has led me to really highlight those issues. And so I'm sorry, I don't know how much time I'm supposed to have for this.
3 more minutes, but if you want to pass.
Oh, sure. No. So that has absolutely been part of the conversation that I've been talking about. It is directly, and not just like my great-great-grandmother. This is like my grandma, who used to clean my knees and band-aid them up when I had a fall, and gave me after-school snacks. This is my grandmother. So it's very recent history. I first got involved simply by registering voters on the Thanatam Nation. And I would register people, and we would find that a simple process like registering to vote was super complicated because of so many systemic reasons, that people didn't have access to voter registration forms, or the lack of internet infrastructure, or simply the confusing language that is sometimes used when people are trying to access websites. And so that is something that I've talked about a lot. I think it's really important for us to talk about Arizona's role as a prison industrial complex when we're talking about the targeting of Black and Brown people and incarceration of Black and Brown bodies in our court systems, and the number of felonies that Black and Brown people have, which ultimately trickles to our voting, which trickles to our representation. And so we have this very top-heavy white supremacist or white supremacy infrastructure that is designed to not only keep people out of these spaces, it is designed to exterminate us. And that is something that we are really, when we're having these historic moments of, a first woman vice president, first woman of color, and all of that type of thing, we really have to think about the amazing amounts. And on top of everything, she has to be extraordinary, not just a woman who's qualified like anybody. She has to be this extraordinary person to get as far as she has gotten, and it is an amazing accomplishment, but it's a glaring it's a glaring reminder that we are fighting against this systemic white supremacy just to get to where we're at right now.
Perfect, thank you. So let's move on to, I see Heidi in my left, top right. So let's move on to Heidi.
Well, I've been studying women's suffrage for the last 30 some years. In the 90s, when our daughter was just little and in grade school, there was, the noise about Election Day on TV. And she said, "Mommy, why don't we have a girl president?" And I've been working on my dissertation and book and looking into what a really slow process it is for women to move up the ladder. And it's, as Gabriella said, people are at different starting lines. And, you're trying to explain to an 8-year-old why there haven't been any women presidents with all the institutional blocks against white women, women of color. It's hard to explain to her, why that was. And when my husband and I looked at each other and we both said the same thing. We didn't think in the 90s that we would ever see a woman president in this country. We got pretty close last time around, and another little hurdle overcome this time around. But it just goes to show you that, I grew up in a time where women were told you can be if you go to college, you can be a nurse or you could be a school teacher, but nothing else. And there were all these institutional roadblocks for women to become candidates. Even, you even the most privileged white women couldn't go to Ivy League schools until very recently. They could not serve as full equals in the military. And when you look at Congress and you look at all the top political offices, where did those people go to? Vast majority have military service. They went to elite schools or graduate schools that were barred for people of color and for women as well to reach the higher echelons. So yes, the starting lines were very staggered for different groups, and it took a long time. But my daughter's now in her 30s, and she's like, the women keep knocking on the door, but they're not quite in the White House. They're close. So I think she's a little bit more optimistic, and so am I, than we even were a few years ago.
Wonderful. So Lisa, how about you?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me on this panel with these amazing women. I got to be honest. I'm always filled with a kind of a sense of melancholy when we pass these types of historical benchmarks. And that's not at all meant to minimize these amazing achievements that are associated with these historic moments. But I do feel a certain sense of sorrow. Theoretically, I understand that I should be thrilled. 100 years ago, women fought for and won the right to vote. In 2020, women and minorities are breaking barriers all over the place. And all of that is wonderful. Those are good things. But I always come back to the same question. Why? Why does it have to be like this? Why do women and minorities always have to fight so hard for so little? And, some of this goes back to, last semester, I gave a community lecture for social and behavioral sciences, SBS, downtown lecture series on the power of Hispanic women. And so I've been actually thinking about this question really deeply for the better half of a year now. And I guess part of my feelings about this have to do with my own identity. So I'm a Latina and a woman in academia. And of course, I've always grown up with and been acutely aware of kind of the challenges that are associated with intersectionality of women and people of color, especially when it comes to those important things like equality, fairness, rights, power, all those wonderful things. But sort of as I prepared for that lecture, I was shocked about how much inequality really still exists for Hispanic women here and now, 2020 back, when I was doing it, but 2021 today. Kind of this idea that when you see it all on paper, it looks much, much worse. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of that lecture. Hispanic women hold very little traditional power in this country. There's only been one Latina Fortune 500 CEO ever. one Latina senator, ever. Two Latina governors, ever. One Hispanic Supreme Court justice, happens to be a woman, but again, ever. And then, sort of these inequalities that trickle down, even if we're not office holders, we're paid shockingly less. So Hispanic women get 54 cents for every dollar earned by a similarly situated white man. Black women fare a little bit better at 64 cents, white women at 82 cents per every dollar of a white male. I don't want to deride white men for being paid fairly either. But what I do want is women of all colors to actually be paid with that same equity. And the scariest thing to me about all this is that they say the gender pay gap is not going to close until 2093. So to put it in a little bit of perspective, I have a 1-year-old. My 1-year-old is going to be 73 years old when the pay gap closes for white women. And my 3-year-old will be 76. So kind of that's what all these feelings bring up. I'm just a little bit sad. It's about my girls and kind of making sure that they don't reach old age before they're treated fairly. With all of this in perspective, I'm happy that these kind of historic firsts keep increasing, and they're increasing the descriptive representation of government. And I think research bears this out, that those changes will bring in equity a little bit quicker. But when all's said and done, it shouldn't have to be this hard. I guess that's kind of where I get to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That's great for setting the stage. So let's take a look back now and look historically. So these next two questions are for Heidi. So Heidi, from the historical perspective, what are some of the lessons from Arizona women winning the right to vote that still resonate today?
Well, I think whether you look at the Arizona battle or the U.S. battle, it was a slow slog, and it addresses some of the concerns that the other panelists are talking about. We think there's just going to be this aha moment and things are going to get better, but it's always 2 steps forward and 1 step back. You think about the women that started the voting rights movement in 1848 in this country. None of them lived to see them get the vote. Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, or anybody else of that age, because it didn't happen in their lifetimes, and they had to dedicate their lives to a movement. So these were things you see in Arizona as well. It took decades of pounding pavements, petitions. And I think the lesson the women in Arizona learned was the politicians are very entrenched. They have a self-interest to hold power, and they were mostly white males, and they didn't want to expand the electorate to include women because God knows how they would vote. And they didn't want to include people of color because they might vote differently too. So what they did in the movement when we reached statehood, they latched on to the direct democracy elements of the state constitution, which gave voters the right to initiative and to amend the ballot. And that's how we got the woman's right to vote. But they took it to the voters, who tended to be more progressive, more updated about notions about womanhood than men who just didn't want to share power. And I don't think that's something that's changed over the years. I think when you talk to voters, they're a lot more amenable to change and opening things up. But getting through the legislatures, the Congress, whatever mechanisms, sometimes can be a slower process of education.
Great. So our next historical question for you, Heidi, would be, in every presidential election since 1984, women voters outnumber men. Why have we not seen a similar success in women elected to office at the state and national levels?
Well, I would argue that there's been tremendous improvement in those categories of elected officials. I think this year we have 142 women in Congress. That's about 24%. You'd like to see it be 50, but it's better than 2 or 3%, which it was for decades in the 1900s. And I think when you see, in the 70s, I think there are only like 20 women total in Congress. So we've made some progress. Same in the state legislatures. There's 5 times as many women in state legislatures now than there were in the 70s and 80s when, the second feminist movement was going on. So I think we have improved. The reasons it takes a while is because running for office is not an easy thing. We could have Gabrielle weigh in on this, but especially for statewide office, higher office, it's very difficult to campaign if you have a young family. You're working nights, evenings, you're traveling. In Arizona, the first woman to sit in the Senate was Frances Willard Munn. She had run the suffrage movement. And then when she was elected to the Senate in 1914, her home was in Prescott. She lived out in a ranch, and her youngest daughter was still in grade school. And she didn't have anyone to watch her daughter during the day. So she brought her to Phoenix during the session, put her in grade school, and after school, her little daughter, Mary Fran, would walk down the street to the state capitol and do her homework on the floor of the state Senate while her mother was conducting business. Childcare is still a problem. A lot of gentlemen who run for office cite the fact that they have families and it's just stressful to be away from home and whatnot. But that has been a major factor when political scientists look at female candidacies. It's just hard to be away from home so much when you have a young child. I think women also have trouble raising money because often donors don't see them as viable candidates, and that's still going on. Hillary Clinton had trouble raising money early in her career, and even after she was nominated for the Democratic ticket, you see other women who have a trouble trying to raise initial funding for their campaigns because donors won't back them. And that was the truth back then in Arizona when Frances Willard Munn again tried to run for Secretary of State. I think it was in 1918. She didn't win the nomination because, and the governor at the time, George Hunt, told her the main campaign propaganda used against her was, if the governor dies or is out of town, the Secretary of State becomes governor, and we couldn't have a woman in a position of responsibility. Women are seen to be more appropriate for legislative positions because that's many people, but less likely to hold governor or president, the pinnacle position, because they would be in the power of governing, have the power of governing alone. So a lot of those institutional biases are slightly better than they were 100 years ago, but only incrementally.
Perfect. Do any other one of the panelists want to care to comment or respond? Same thing.
Yeah. We don't value. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Gabriella. Go ahead.
We don't value the work that is typically seen as women's work. We don't value childcare. We don't value taking care of the home, cooking, cleaning, any of those things, which those are work. We pay people to do those tasks for us. But when we're talking about campaigning, that is something that does come up. And I was really interested in Joanna Mendoza, who ran for legislative district in LD 11. She was listing some of her campaign expenses as childcare, and it was a controversial thing for her to do, but she absolutely needed it as a single mother. My children are actually going to be 20 on Friday. I didn't have that issue with childcare and that sort of thing. But as far as the money thing, I mean, that was something, you may or may not know that I made newspaper. There was tons of articles that came out about me taking, I decided to pay myself for my campaign after my contract for my job had ended. I floated for about a month without a paycheck at all. And then I started paying myself because part of what I talk about all the time is valuing the work of Indigenous women, Black and Brown women, paying them for the work that they're doing. And so when I was in this moment of like, oh my God, I don't have any money coming in, I was like, I need to run for office, but maybe I should apply for Joe Biden's campaign or Mark Kelly's because I'm really good at campaigning. But, that was not valuing my own work, and that I was already benefiting their campaigns by running and reaching communities of color who they were not reaching out to. And so I made that decision, and it was kind of controversial, but it ended up being a really huge fundraiser for us. And we raised like $20,000 in 2 days. It was really insane. But you're right. And, that is a constant challenge. Getting other people to believe in your work and believe in your passion and whether or not you're qualified. I was getting comments about my age or the appearance of my age because I'm pushing 40, and my competency and my education, and really people were really like digging to try to find ways to disqualify me for running for this position. And it was just it's really aggravating. You get a lot more of all of those type of microaggressions and ways that they exclude you, and it's very hard. It's very difficult.
So moving on to Lisa, so we'll start with your questions now, Lisa, because I see we're moving through time really wonderfully. In your book chapter, A Mirage in the Desert, Arizona and Latinos in the 26th presidential election, you write that, and I quote, Latinos are faced with a plethora of systemic barriers that contribute to historically low voter turnout rates, end quote. Can you talk about some of those barriers and what the individuals and institutions can do to remove those barriers?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the $64 million question among the political parties right now. So it's a fantastic question. And you're right. Latinos have long been sort of accused of punching below their weight when it comes to voter turnout. So to give you an idea here, since about 2008, the national Latino turnout has hovered just shy of 50%. But the kind of the bright spot in all this is that estimates are suggesting that in 2020, Latino turnout may have actually increased over those numbers by about 15%, over 15% in 2016. So that's really good news. And it means that maybe some of these barriers might be easing somewhat. But of course, sort of to kind of get more at your question, obviously voting laws are meant to kind of prescribe the manner in which voting is to take place in a given state. Sounds really easy, but it is probably the most complex thing I think we do as a government, as a set of governments. And all they're trying to do is essentially balance access to the ballot box with security of voting. And it sounds really simple to say those things, but it's actually a really difficult balancing act. And the issue arises when eligible voters are deterred from voting by the laws that the states create that are disproportionately affecting one population over another. So that's really where all this gets in, everybody gets in hot water, of course. And Latinos have been long deterred from voting through use of poll taxes, historically through poll taxes, literacy tests, language discrimination, et cetera. The barriers for Latinos for voting pre-civil rights were actually really similar to those being suffered by African Americans during that period. So these two movements were kind of going on simultaneously. In the civil rights movement, overhauled this kind of behavior as best as they could. And a lot of those protections are still with us today. But one important change happened in 2013 that allowed a lot of states to have a little bit more freedom in changing the voting laws with the effect that some populations are less likely to vote. And what I'm referring to is the Supreme Court in 2013 striking down the pre-clearance portion of the Voting Rights Act. And so that gave more, as I said, more wiggle room to the states. So, talking about what's deterring Latinos, what are these, sometimes I say barriers in 2016, but I would say they're really more deterrents. I think almost that's an even better language today to describe these. So if you think about sort of prior to Election Day, Latinos have a very different socio-demographic realities from other groups in this country. So they have low education, low income, high poverty rates, low internet access. They're very young. All of these things mean that they're less likely to vote a priori, based on what we understand from political science research. And then following that, some state laws actually make it a lot more difficult for Latinos to register to vote. So increases in the length of residency before registering to vote could be considered one big barrier or deterrent to Latino voting. Stringent proof of residency requirements have kind of increased among state laws recently. There are longer periods between registration and Election Day. And all of these have kind of the same effect of creating a disproportionate deterrence on Latinos over other populations. And we know that when these are reversed, and I don't mean reversed in the sense of, you could think about it in the sense of some have laws and then they take them off the books, but more in kind of the laboratory of democracy sense, where, over in California, there's different laws than over in Florida or Colorado or New York. So when we don't see these legal situations surrounding registration, Latinos have higher rates of voting. So we have an idea that works. Latinos are also less likely to be mobilized to vote. Mobilized is a fancy word meaning to be asked to vote. So, and it's actually a really powerful predictor of your likelihood of turning out. In some metrics are suggesting that Latinos are only mobilized 42 days prior to the presidential election. And for other groups, they are rigorously mobilized throughout the entire process by candidates, parties, PACs, super PACs. They're just loaded down with mobilization. Latinos aren't being asked. And that's just before the process of voting. So when it comes to actually casting a ballot, a lot of states have made it more difficult by decreasing the early voter period. And a lot of Latinos rely very heavily on that for casting their ballots because of those socio-demographic realities. They've shortened wait periods for requesting absentee ballots. We've seen those laws crop up across the country. On Election Day, there are also multiple deterrents to voting. There's an increase in voter ID laws that has deterred many eligible Latinos from voting. And kind of the worrisome part about the ID laws is even when they're repealed or when they're not on the books, we know that Latinos are asked above and beyond the legal means that the state has put into effect for voter ID. So there is a discrimination process that's built into the street level bureaucrats who are creating our election system on Election Day. What else? The use of precincts itself might deter Latinos from casting ballots. So a lot of Latinos don't live and work in the same part of town. So on Election Day, if your precinct is tied to your home address and you're already at work, you have to get off work, go back to where you live, and then drive back to your work, and then drive back home. Well, for a lot of people, that's not a big deal, but for people who are, who are socioeconomically distressed already, or who are hourly wage workers, there's opportunity costs built into that and resource costs. Finally, you can think about, we've seen a lot of states in this last election decreasing the number of precincts in low income and diverse areas. In my opinion, we should be going the other way. If we want it to be easy to vote, we need more precincts or voter centers where they're not address tied. We have the internet. You can kind of type in your address and print up the ballot. New Mexico is doing this, and vote at any voting center. So we know that those things have real impacts on Latinos being able to vote or being deterred from voting. Now, changing the laws, the mechanics of what the law does is pretty simple to see, but it requires political will, and that is very difficult to achieve, changing election laws for those purposes.
So that's a great segue to our final question, the formal portion of our discussion. This is for Gabrielle and talking about accessibility for voting. So one of the issues of your campaign was to increase accessibility for voting. What measures have the Recorder's Office would increase accessibility? Are there any legislative challenges that are necessary to?
Well, oh my gosh, this is such a huge question. So first of all, I want to say I'm so excited to hear you talking about voting centers. This is something that I have been advocating for a really long time, and I'm actually in a position where I get to change that, which is really exciting. And it's the prerogative of whoever is running elections, and that is a position like the recorder that most people don't know anything about, and you recognize how huge of an impact something like that can have. So absolutely. Right now, though, as far as legislatively, in the state legislature, there are so many anti-voter bills. It is ridiculous. There is a bill right now that is trying to get people to complete a notarized voter registration form. So if you think about the time that it takes for you to go and seek a notary, or how obscure that is, or the fact that it costs money sometimes, which can also be something like a poll tax. We are trying to bring poll taxing back to voting because of the xenophobia that exists in Arizona State Legislature, where they are hyper concerned with whether or not people are citizens who are voting. But there are already check systems in place that capture that situation. And so there's no need for something like that. But those types of things are constantly brought up within our legislature. The fact that people with felonies as a whole cannot vote, this is something that we don't talk about very often, but that whole concept itself is directly related to slavery and the emancipation of slaves, of people who were enslaved. Pardon me, I'm trying to use the correct language there. And we wanted to, our government wanted to, be mindful, or they really were concerned that suddenly a whole bunch of people would suddenly have the right to vote. And so they made it really easy to get felonies and made it so that anybody who had a felony could not participate. We never talk about how, voting is allowed in prisons in other countries, or we talk about, who has the right to vote, or the fact that you could lose the right to vote. And we've actually also criminalized voting, so that if you do vote, for example, if you register to vote and for some reason your voter registration makes it all the way through and you vote, and you had a felony somewhere on your record, and you hadn't gotten your rights restored, you can be criminalized and charged with a felony for voting. So there's so many, legislatively, there's so many different things that are keeping people from doing that. Practically, right now, some of the things that are going to help are things that don't require legislative control, such as the voting centers, which would allow you to vote at any location. The early voting system is 27 days of you being able to cast a ballot at any location, which is really amazing. It's a really amazing thing, and helps people who are maybe working non-traditional hours, exactly like Lisa was saying. We're talking about people who are in these most vulnerable situations, who are going to have the most difficulty getting to the ballot box, or sometimes people are concerned about their mailboxes and whether or not they're going to get stuff stolen out of them, depending, the neighborhood, different things like that. And so they want to go and feel that their vote is secure, and they try to go to early voting sites, and the early voting sites are not in communities where there are high numbers of Black and Brown people or low socioeconomic situations. And so those are things that people like me get to decide, and we get to choose where we allocate those resources. So,
So with that, let's make that the last response, because I see a lot of questions rolling in and I want to make sure we have time to do that. So thank you, Gabriela, thank you, Lisa and Heidi for that. But let's move on to some of the questions rolling in. And this one, so let's start with this one. We have about 10 minutes left. So looking at the first question for everyone on the panel, the question is, if you were to offer one wish or suggestion for the most consequential action or actions one person could take to support more women of color in government, what would that be?
I would suggest going out and support somebody running for office, because that's the biggest hurdle. But most people are especially women, are very hesitant to throw their hats in the ring. And historically speaking, women have been reluctant to run, needed to have like a group behind them to support them. And so if you know somebody that's talented, that knows their stuff, get behind her and say, you should be running for office.
I would say address the white supremacy that is plaguing your institution, whether that be in academia, within your place of employment, within your political circles, or whatever space that is to make those spaces more welcoming and address the white supremacy so that it is a safe space, so that women of color can get involved, and so that they feel welcomed and are able to connect with whatever political aspirations they have. What I'm seeing right now happen, even within the Democratic Party, is women of color are largely wanting to quit. People who are precinct committee people who spend a Saturday on a 6-hour meeting, they're being chased away because they hear the white supremacy in these meetings and nobody addresses it. And so it doesn't feel like a safe space, and they don't want to get involved. If you don't have women showing up to your meetings, nobody is going to lead the meeting. If you don't have women who are leading these meetings, there's nobody going to run for office. So it needs to start on a much lower level.
Lisa?
Heidi and Gabriella have hit some wonderful points. Actually, Heidi, you took my point. But I would add to that, that's how good it was. I'm just kidding. I would add to that a lot of this falls back on issues of inequity, just at the basic levels. I mean, we have women of color are not as educated. They have a difficulty getting through that process. So right there, you're out of the gate. You already have sort of a ding against you. There's already a barrier in front of you. So if we could fix some of the educational, the income sort of issues, because this is a wish, I think that would help a lot. But doing that is very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So we still have time for one last question. Is there any questions, any other questions in the chat?
I would also say, when we're talking about women, be thinking about how you can incorporate childcare into whatever issue or organization that you have. And then also, if you are asking women of color in particular to be a part of something that requires their specific knowledge, like, oh, you are, if you are requiring that or you're asking for that and you recognize it as something special and you want it to be shared, make sure you're paying them. Make sure you're paying them for your enrichment of your event or your space, and in whatever ways that you can do that. Figure out honorariums, figure out ways to get people paid, because we're talking so much about how much we value Black and brown people and diversifying and all of these things, but we're not actually putting dollars and cents towards budgeting, towards incorporating. Like, that's, if you want to see where an organization's values are, you look at their budget. So where in your budget are you paying for people to enrich? Otherwise, you're just tokenizing.
Absolutely. And are you paying them fairly? Are you paying them at the same rate? I think that's also a big piece of this. So, amen.
Well, with that brings to a close our discussion for tonight. I want to thank each of our panelists, Gabriela, Heidi, and Lisa, for taking their time and spending their evening with us tonight. I also want to thank my co-curators, Mary Feeney and Dr. Patricia Parkerdale, for curating this exhibit for us and for working on bringing this event to here. I also would like to say thank you to the audience for supporting UA Libraries and Special Collections programming. It's because of your continued interest we're able to bring the best of our civic and academic communities together for these types of events. So please continue to do that. I'd like to put a call out to our next event in this series related to our Founding Mothers virtual exhibit, which is, we'll be turning to the university campus, and we'll focus on the history and the future of gender and women's studies here at the University of Arizona. Join us the week of March 8th for a conversation with Eliana Rivero, Professor Emerita of Spanish and Portuguese, Judy Temple, former department head in Women's Studies and Professor Emerita of Gender and Women's Studies in English, and then Stephanie Troutman Robbins, current department head for Gender and Women's Studies and Associate Professor in Rhetoric, Composition, and the Teaching of English. One final note, we are recording this evening discussion, and it will be available on Special Collections website and also the Funding Mothers digital exhibit website. In addition, all of our registrants will receive an email with a link to a recording if they wanted to do it that way. So that's it, and I want to say thank you again, and good night.